Good afternoon to you all. So let me begin by firstly thanking the organisers for today's event. As I'll show you in the data in a minute, the problem of climate change is primarily a problem of scale. And I just want to spend a little bit of time introducing to you how large a problem it is that we have in front of us to solve. I actually just came into Tokyo from London, where it was a little rainy as usual. But while I was away in my own country in Australia, a series of pretty significant extreme weather events have been playing themselves out. In some of the towns on the border of Victoria, the state of Victoria, and the state of New South Wales, you had temperatures for more than a week in a row of above 45 degrees Celsius. In some of the smaller inland towns within the state of Queensland in the north, you had towns where the temperature increased to more than 50 degrees Celsius. In the river which runs along the border of Victoria and New South Wales, as a direct result of the heat, the amount of oxygen in the river fell to dangerously low levels, and a very large number of fish, some say in the hundreds of thousands, died. So I used to teach, public policy issues around climate change in Washington, D.C., and I would always say to my students that the problem of climate change was what we might call a wicked problem in kind of policy language. What do I mean by that? I mean that mostly our expectation has been that to solve the problem, we have to pay the cost today. That is, we have to change the way we invest and change the way that we consume today. But in doing so, thank you. In doing so, we primarily help to avert problems that will be faced by future generations. Okay, and there are lots of problems with the discipline of economics. One of its assumptions is that people are essentially selfish in nature. But the idea is that, why would we today want to pay those costs when it's future generations that would face the real risks, not ourselves, right? So in seeing, this kind of weather that we saw over the last week or so in Australia, it really struck me that formulation or that way of thinking about the problem of climate change is no longer as relevant as I once thought that it was. That is that the speed at which these kinds of, fairly extreme weather events are emerging in countries such as my own is quite significantly faster than a lot of people really expected. Okay, so in a way, to me, that's a real call to action to think about this problem. So what I wanted to do in the time that I have with you is to firstly contextualize renewable energy and the growth of renewable energy within the global energy picture. Okay, what does this change look like? And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Japan's energy transition. That is, from outside, where do I see where Japan is up to? And what kinds of issues is Japan facing as it focuses on decarbonizing its energy sector? Let me also say that in the interest of time, there are a few really important things that there is not time to talk about in this session. Firstly, I'm going to focus on the electricity sector mainly. Now, in the case of Japan, that makes a lot of sense, okay? the electricity sector is enormously important to Japan's greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to transport, that is motor vehicles. Okay? But obviously, if you go to Indonesia, for example, deforestation or forestry is a really important part of their carbon picture. Okay, so we're going to focus on electricity, and we're not going to really have time to talk about the mobility sector, that is battery electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles, although Japan is a real leader in developing the technology around these particular areas. We're also not going to have time to think about longer term energy transition issues, such as the emergence of a hydrogen economy. So Australia and Japanese governments are both very interested in the potential for hydrogen for decarbonizing sectors of the economy which are difficult to get at. And I think it's a very important subject, but it's longer term, and in the interest of time, we're not going to have a chance to talk about that. Lastly, I'm looking forward very much to the breakout sessions that we have today to be able to continue our conversation.
And actually, I have prepared my speech in English. I was thinking that maybe I will speak in Japanese, but I prepared my speech in English. But in the breakout session, I would like to respond to your questions or get involved in discussions with you in Japanese.
So the first thing I wanted to do was to show you some good news. Okay, this is something that you have seen in other guises already today. This is measured on the y-axis in terms of terawatt hours. That is generated electricity. Okay, electricity which is being generated and thus being consumed. Okay, and what this shows you, if you look at what it is how rapidly the amount of electricity, not just installed capacity, but actual generated electricity from solar photovoltaics and from wind power has increased. In fact, I didn't include the slide today, but there's a terrific analysis which has been done of the International Energy Agency's assessments of how much renewables generation we are going to have. Every year they do an assessment, and then what the reality was. And it shows that, the best estimates have systematically underestimated how quickly solar and wind would enter into our electricity system. Okay, we've systematically underestimated how quickly that has. What's happened now? There we go. What that has happened, and for every unit that you see growing here of solar and wind, that means one less unit of coal, of natural gas, or of heavy oil, which is being used to meet the needs of people such as you and I. And as was mentioned in the morning session, this increase in the generation of electricity is partly driven by very rapid falls in price. So in a number of markets today, you see solar being sold into electricity markets at something equivalent to around 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And what that means is that it is competitive with existing fossil fuel generation on a non-subsidized basis. Okay, so even without government intervention to support the consumption of this energy source, that very quickly in a number of markets, it is becoming cost competitive. Okay, and that's a pretty extraordinary development, and one that we really didn't expect to see 10 years ago, or certainly not as rapidly as we have seen it. I don't want to belabor this. These numbers are small and a little bit difficult to see here, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the amount of investment which is occurring globally within renewable energy. Generally, you can see here, this is in billions of US dollars, okay? So, you're really looking at pretty extraordinary increases on large numbers of investment, hundreds of billions of dollars being invested. It's not quite as much as being invested in the oil, gas industries yet, but it's getting there, okay? And, within a decade, I would expect that these numbers would, really be very close to the amount of money which is being invested in helping to produce fossil fuels. That's terrific. So, lest you get too optimistic, let me talk a little bit about the problem of scale. So the first two lines that you see here are the lines that I showed you on the previous graph, okay? And they show you that growth in global solar and wind. But you can also see that there's a long way to go for them to meet the amount of electricity which is being generated by, for example, nuclear power today, okay? We've had a number of energy revolutions since industrialization, right? The first of these, the creation of the steam engine and the use of coal rather than biomass to provide, energy-related services. The second of those is the rise in petroleum, which has replaced things like whale oil in lighting, and of course has become a big part of the transport sector today. The third energy revolution, if you like, is the nuclear revolution, which happened after the oil shocks in the 1970s, including here in Japan. And then really what we're at today is the fourth energy revolution, if you like, okay? But you can see that there's quite a long way to go, even to match what we saw during the oil shocks in the 1970s, okay, in terms of just generated electricity. Now, here's my third, I guess, set of lines, and you can see the first three of those again here, okay? So that was the previous graph that I showed you. Who can guess what the last one is? You can guess by the color. So that's electricity generated using thermal coal, okay? And so it's important when we think about this problem not only to focus on this picture or the investment numbers that I showed you in the table a moment ago, but to really think about this number, right? And when we start getting this to replace this at scale, okay, at scale. So this is where we're up to today, okay? We've gone from basically no renewables in the system to 16% of global electricity generated by wind and solar power. This does not include hydro, right? That's compared to coal, which currently sits at around 38% of global power generated. Okay. We're doing pretty well, but there's a long way to go. Now let me shift the lens. Okay, up until now, I've shown you terawatt hours. Okay, so the amount of electricity that's being generated. Here, the y-axis is different. Okay, this is not kilowatt hours or electricity generated. This is greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so these are the emissions which are associated partly with the burning of fossil fuels. So it's a slightly different metric. It's the output, actually the thing that we care about, right? We care about, which is greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And what this shows you, and this is from the IPCC reports, you can read them yourself, is that greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase, okay? And that's because even though renewables have been increasing rapidly, that consumption of fossil fuels are also continuing to increase, okay? We're nearly at the point that as energy demand globally goes up, that renewables take up the marginal annual increase in electricity, okay? But we're not quite there yet. And so even as we see renewables go up, you can also see oil associated with the personal transport market in particular, India and China obviously growing, with natural gas and with coal continuing to grow. And what that means is that CO2 emissions continue to go up. And actually where we need to get to is this line to start going in the other direction and get to net zero. And when we get that to net zero, right down the bottom there, when we get to net zero, then the atmosphere will begin to find a new equilibrium in terms of global temperatures, right? So that's kind of the task which is in front of us. I think that we're doing as humanity, we're trying to do something very big in a fairly short period of time, and we're getting there, and we will get there. It's a question of timing. Okay. So that's the kind of global picture. Let me talk now a little bit about Japan and Japan's renewable energy transition. In a way, Japan is a microcosm, okay, or an example of that broader story that I just told to you. As you may know, Japan has the presidency of the G20 this year. We've got a series of meetings coming up, meetings with the energy ministers from the G20 in late June, I believe it is, and others. And I was very happy to see that Prime Minister Abe highlighted the issue of climate change as one of two key issues that he wants Japan to think about as part of its presidency of the G20. The other, of course, is the trade issue. So it's really terrific to see that, and Japan is got some reasonable commitments around its decarbonization plans. So these are Japan's committed plans for reducing the amount of carbon associated with electricity use in the power sector by 2030. Okay. What Japan is committed to doing is reducing the amount of emissions broadly by 26% from 2013 numbers by 2030. Okay, so about a quarter reduction or something like that. And that's the kind of goal that Japan's committed to. How are we tracking in relation to that number? Well, you can see that here. Okay. One of the terrific things about having an international agreement on climate is that every government is required to produce these great numbers. Like, we didn't have these numbers on what was going on in the world, but now everyone tracks the stuff. Statistical agencies put it together and submit it, and so you can really get a good idea about what's going on. And what you can see here is that obviously there's an emissions increase post Fukushima, but emissions have started to tail away, right? In fact, we've had a decrease of about 8% from our 2013 numbers by today. So we've got 16% to go, right, in the next 11 years. Okay, that's quite a lot. It gets harder the more you do as well. So, but they're going down, not up. And if you look at why that is, you can pretty clearly see that when you look at the power sector. Okay, this is the emissions associated with Japan's electricity sector. And I don't need to read this to you. The main difference that you see is, firstly, the growth in renewable energy. Okay, there it is there. I'll show you a breakdown of that in a minute. And then down here, nuclear power. So nuclear power is coming back on a bit. Okay, now I know that that is a very controversial subject, but at least in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, nuclear power displaces fossil fuels and therefore contributes to reducing CO2 emissions. Okay, there are other problems with nuclear power, obviously, but if one only looks at this piece of it, that's the function that it's playing. Why is that going on? Well, because we've got more, particularly solar power being generated. Maybe I should skip through this quickly because I think you saw these numbers before. But particularly solar energy, the bottom here is hydro. So this is all our run-of-the-river hydro. We've got biomass, hasn't changed a whole lot, a little bit of geothermal, wind power, it should be a lot more. But it's not yet, and then also growth in solar generation. So you can see that solar in particular has taken off. And as was mentioned to us this morning, a big part of that is because of policy. Okay, Japan introduced a feed-in tariff in 2012, and the feed-in tariff had led to a lot of investment going into renewable energy, particularly into solar PV. Okay, so about 85% of registered projects under feed-in tariff are solar projects, okay? So really, collectively, I mean, I live in Australia, but most of you live in Japan, I think. So collectively, this is thanks to your hard work, right? Because what a feed-in tariff does is it gives the investor a guaranteed rate of return on building these facilities, and then it passes the costs of that guarantee onto household electricity prices. So every household is paying a little bit more in their electricity, and that is being transferred across to people who are building these facilities. So, if that's kind of where Japan's emissions stand, we're going in the right direction, we've got to go further and faster, then what are the major concerns that Japan has to face as a country when it thinks about driving more renewables or low carbon energy, let's say, into the energy picture? The biggest issue is cost, okay? And what this shows you here is from government figures, from INITO, the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy, and it shows you a cost comparison, okay, between Japanese solar PV, large-scale solar PV at the top, and wind projects below. You can see here that the average cost of bringing one of these projects to a market in Japan is more than it costs in Europe, okay, quite significantly more than it costs in Europe. Now, I first came to Japan in 1989, and I remember back then Japan was pre-bubble, so it was the story of, everyone buys, when you buy a cup of coffee in Tokyo, it costs you $10, right? It was kind of the story. And so one way you could kind of explain this is to say, well, Japan is a high-cost place to do business, right? You've got complex supply chains around this, this kind of thing, and it's driving high costs. But what we've learned recently is that's really not the case, okay? So I was never really satisfied with those numbers we saw before because it's the average, okay? It's the average price. And I always thought to myself, okay, well, some of those projects are probably expensive, and some of them might be cheap. And that's what I really want to know about, okay? What's the potential for driving costs down? And quite happily, about 2 months ago, that information has been provided to us, okay? So, the government surveys developers, and then they, everyone has an incentive to answer, of course, and so developers answer how much it costs them to develop their projects. This is for solar, and this is for onshore wind, not offshore, but onshore, okay? And what you can see here is that for both solar and for onshore, that there are a number of companies which are bringing these technologies to the electricity market at quite low prices. Okay, not 20 yen per kilowatt hour, but 7 yen per kilowatt hour. And when you're thinking about 7 yen per kilowatt hour, then you're getting pretty competitive with existing fossil fuel generation within the market. Not quite there yet, but you're getting down to those kinds of numbers. Okay, so one of the big questions for me as I look at this is how can we get more of the projects which are being built in Japan down to that level of cost, okay, in which you can begin to compete against fossil fuel-based generation. And the answer to that is not yet clear. One of the reasons is because of supply chains. So the cheaper projects here tend to be getting their equipment from relatively low-cost suppliers. Okay, so the question is, how do we kind of help other companies do that kind of thing? The other issue, as I'll talk about in a minute, is access to the transmission grid. Okay, so locational choices. So where you put yourself determines how much it costs you to connect to the grid, and that cost is a big part of how much the project ultimately becomes. So solving issues around the electricity grid becomes a really important issue. Okay. Yeah. So let me explain a little what I mean by that. I guess there are some people who maybe focus on this, so this might be information that but Japan, a lot like actually the eastern side of Australia, has a long, skinny grid, right? Keto. And in the sector that I'm spending a lot of time looking at today, which is yojo furyoku, or offshore wind, I'm just saying that for the interpreters, that a lot of the capacity is located up here. Okay, potential capacity is located up here. The population center is down here. Okay, and grid capacity in this area is constrained. Okay, so we've got to do something about grid capacity constraints. And so the big debate that you see in Japan today is around this issue. Okay, one, how much capacity is really there? How much of it is reserved for nuclear power plants, right? How much of it is available to new renewable energy projects? We don't really know the answer to that question yet. But it's something that we're looking at the moment. There are a lot of quite complex issues around this, but they're very similar issues to the kinds of things you face, for example, in Germany, right? So Germany has a lot of offshore wind going in the north of the country, and they're building new transmission lines into the major population centers. So, like other countries in this renewable energy revolution, Japan's facing significant issues around access to the transmission grid, and I look forward to seeing those discussions move forward. Really, price and transmission are the two issues I think matter the most today in the renewable energy market. I've just got a couple of minutes left, so let me talk about where I think that we're going. Okay, what are the big questions that we have that we're left to deal with? To my mind, there are three of them, okay? The first is nuclear power. Now, this shows you all the nuclear power units which exist in Japan, okay? And there are different colors here. One is green, one is orange, and one is red. Green means it's restarted. Red means the utility has, the owner of the facility has committed to decommissioning the facility. And orange means that that no clear decision has been made yet, or they have submitted to have it restarted. Okay, so they're kind of in between. And you can also see the governors of the different prefectures here, with a green box around it. Green box means they support nuclear restarts. A red box means they oppose nuclear restarts. So there's a very complicated negotiation that's going on now about the costs of restarting a nuclear power plant and local acceptance to that, okay? But the best analysis that I have seen is that we're probably going to have somewhere in the region of 10% of our electricity in Japan coming from nuclear by 2030. Okay, not 22, as the government has said, but maybe 10%. So the one big question is, what is going to happen to nuclear power? The next question is, if nuclear is not going to be 20% of power, what's going to make up the difference? Okay. There are three possible answers here. One is renewables, offshore wind, probably. One is natural gas, although it's expensive. And the third is coal. Okay, and one of the things that you may have noticed, and I've noticed, there are a large number of coal-fired power plants which are currently undergoing environmental assessment in Japan. Okay, the companies have applied to build a new coal-fired power plant. And, this would lead the lines to start going in the other direction, right? The direction we don't want to see them going in. So what happens to these coal-fired power plants? Okay, are they going to be built or not? Is a really, really important question. And then the third big issue that I think Japan is going to deal with in the next few years is liberalization of the electricity market. Okay, next year we're going to see unbundling. That means that generation and retail will be separated from transmission. How does that change the investment decisions of Tokyo Electric or Kansai Electric, Chubu Electric, et cetera, et cetera? That's a really big question that remains unsolved as yet, okay? And I'm looking forward to seeing how that problem resolves itself. So ultimately, the government said, in Japan, greenhouse gas emissions are going to fall by 26% by 2030 relative to 2013 numbers, based on an assessment you see here. Okay, nuclear is going to be 20 to 22%, they've said. Okay, but my guess is that will not be 20 to 22% of electricity. So the big question is, what's going to make up that gap? Is it going to be coal? Is it going to be gas? Or, as I hope, is it going to be renewables, and particularly offshore wind? Let me make one final point. The climate problem is a global problem. Okay, so in Australia right now, we have ministers passing lumps of coal around in our parliament. It's a little embarrassing. Sorry about that. And one of the arguments that are made in Australia, that is made in Australia, is that even if Australians ate coal for the rest of their lives, it wouldn't make much of a difference to the global picture, okay? Because it's a global commons problem, right? There's not many people in Australia after all. But in my view, no country is an island, and that includes Japan. Although I know we say, Japan's Shimaguni and this kind of stuff. Okay, and another policy which I hope that Mr. Abe talks about during the G20 presidency is Japan's export of coal generation technology. Okay, so Japan, amongst the G7 countries, is by far the largest exporter of coal-related technology for power plants in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and other places. And my guess is if we see the trends continue on climate like we see today, these plants can't run for 40 years. They're going to have to be switched off at some point. And so, although we can focus on the domestic picture, I hope that certainly Mr. Abe also talks about this, the coal financing and how that fits within the broader picture. Because as I said, although every country has to pull its weight, no country is an island when it comes to the problem of climate change. Ultimately, what I think is going to have to happen is what we like to call supply-side policies. Okay. Now, up until now, I focused on the demand side. They've been very successful. Okay, subsidize the demand for renewable energy, and we get a lot of renewable energy. But as we saw, demand for fossil fuels is also going up. At some point, that means we're going to have to think about policies to slow and reverse the increases in demand for fossil fuels. And, we can call those supply-side policies. And I really, as someone who works at a university but also spends time in the business world, this is, I think, a very important issue that the business community, as well as the academic and government communities, are going to need to begin to think about in the years to come. So I'll finish my remarks here. Thanks for listening. If you're interested in any of this sort of stuff, like most other academics, I'm hopelessly, have to kind of sell myself. And so I have a website, and if you want to read any more about these kinds of issues, I'd welcome your thoughts and comments there. Thanks for your time.